Well, our speaker is someone I was just thrilled to be able to get. Tina Ramirez graduated from Vanguard University not that many years ago. She got a BA in History and Political Science and then an MA in Education, taught junior high and high school, but all along she had been interested in human rights. She studied at the Institute for Human Rights in Strasbourg while a student. Later on got a master's degree from the University of Essex in the UK and is now living in Washington, D.C., where she has spent the last 9 years defending oppressed communities in more than 30 countries. And these aren't just Christian communities. This is any place where religious freedom is being pilloried and cursed and being violated. In fact, in 2012, she was awarded the second annual Ahmadiyya Muslim Humanitarian Award for her work defending Muslim communities. So she is a fellow believer, a sister in Christ, believes deeply in religious freedom. And among the people she defends are Christians, but not the only ones she defends. Anyway, Tina, I'm so glad you're here. Thanks for coming over. And let's welcome her in the name of Christ.
Thanks for having me. Hello, Westmont. It's nice to be here. Are you awake? I told them to turn up the lights a little bit so I could actually see you and make sure you're not sleeping on me. You wouldn't do that in chapel, would you? No. Now I can hear you. So, does anyone remember what you were doing for Mother's Day this year? Anyone? It's usually a very special time of the year. It's the one day your mothers will never let you forget, right? Okay, so I hope you remember. But whether you remember exactly what you were doing or not, you remember that you did something because we all have to celebrate it here. Well, this Mother's Day, I was in Virginia, where I live, and I got a phone call from some friends in Sudan that a woman had just been imprisoned for apostasy, which you just heard a minute ago, similar to blasphemy, but is where somebody changes their faith and then is sentenced to death for it, because that is an illegal thing to do in Sudan and in many countries, actually in 20 countries in the world today. So I just got news that this woman had been sentenced to death. She had 3 days to recant her faith or they'd put her to death. So on Mother's Day, this woman who already had a 20-month-old son and was 8.5 months pregnant was sent to a prison in Sudan in the heat of summer in May, shackled to the floor, and every day would have imams come in and try to force her to recant her faith. And for 3 days, we were in touch with her lawyers. And then on the last day at the court hearing, the judge sentenced her. She refused to recant. And all of that time, here this innocent woman, for no fault of her own other than choosing to follow Christ, was sentenced to death. It just seemed so inhumane. And it is, because no one is hardwired for that kind of existence, are they? Her little son wasn't hardwired to be able to live in a prison cell, prevented from seeing his father. You can't imagine spending a Mother's Day like that, could you? Instead, in the organization that I've started, it's called Hardwired. And I believe that every human being, like this woman, who you've probably heard her name, maybe the hashtag Rescue Miriam, Save Miriam. Has anyone heard of that? Okay. She wasn't hardwired for this bondage. She was hardwired for freedom. And that's what I've been spending the last 10 years of my life working on and that I want to share with you this morning. Today in the world, as Mr. Patterson shared, there are many people being persecuted for their faith. In fact, there are 5.3 billion people in the world that live in countries where they have no freedom of religion. That's about 3/4 of the world's population. Now, I know that a lot of you are probably interested in a lot of justice issues like trafficking and refugees and child marriage and many others, right? 5.3 billion is pretty staggering, isn't it? And as I've worked on these issues, one of the things that I've had to remember is that if I tried to help people like Miriam or others in my own strength, there's no way I could do it. And as many of you go out into the world, as I did 15 years ago from college, if we try to change the world on our own strength, we just won't be able to. And I can tell you from my experience in the last 15 years, I've had many successes and many failures. Miriam's story ended well, and I'm going to share that with you today, but there are many stories that didn't end well. And when those stories don't end well, one of the things we have to remember is that we're not struggling against flesh and blood. We're struggling against angels and spirits and principalities of an eternal nature that we can't see necessarily. And we need to fight it with our spiritual capacity, not our physical one, or else we'll grow very tired and discouraged. Now, many of you are probably wondering how you can change the world, right? How can you end things like trafficking, religious oppression, so many of these injustices? Well, let me tell you about what happened in Miriam's case. As many of you know, within 6 weeks she was freed. But the situation a couple of years ago was very different for Miriam and for other Christians in Sudan. A couple of years ago, the south of Sudan had just split off from the country. And when that happened, the peace agreement that had held the country together was disbanded. So President Bashir, who had already murdered 2 million Christians and indigenous people in South Sudan, over 250,000 Muslims in Darfur, and many others, he was now in charge of the north again, on his own, without any hindrance from the south, and he decided to implement criminal Sharia law throughout the country. Basically, the freedom that people had experienced for a few years under this peace agreement was no longer in existence. And the Christians there were very, very concerned because of what they had experienced in the past. So the Christians came to me and they asked me for my help. They said, Tina, we have this new government. We know that he's going to draft a new constitution, but we don't know what to do. We know that we want our freedom, but we don't know how to articulate our rights. So what I do in my organization is I provide legal training on the ground to grassroots leaders that are willing to risk their lives to stand up and defend this freedom for themselves and for others. So I train the Christian leaders. We help them unite together in a broad coalition, not just amongst the Christians, but amongst the Muslims. We had many people in the community that were women's rights advocates, that were indigenous believers, and some that just didn't believe anything. And once we united these people, we taught them strategies to advocate for religious freedom in the country. Now, one of the things that they learned that they found so fascinating, especially the women's rights leaders and the ethnic minorities, people from Darfur, is that religious freedom wasn't just for the Christians, it was actually for everybody, because the women had been persecuted under these Sharia laws in the same way that the Muslims in Darfur had been. And unless everybody had the freedom of conscience and wasn't facing this oppression by a government that was committed to imposing a specific belief system on everybody, no one would ever be free. So they joined hands together and they actively began to share religious freedom and the meaning of religious freedom with everyone. The women's rights leaders, the Muslim women that we trained, they actually got this provision that the Christians drafted for the Constitution adopted in the draft Constitution. And then they kept moving. So when Miriam was imprisoned and they called me and they said, Tina, what do? We said, we will stand with you, do what you need to do. And they sprang into action, not because of me, but because they were hardwired for freedom. Not for their own freedom, but for their freedom and the freedom of others. And they recognized that unless this government in Sudan recognized Miriam's freedom as a woman, as a Christian, and as a human being, none of them would have any freedom. So they immediately went to the court. When Miriam was being tried that final day, a few days after Mother's Day, they sat behind her, and then after she was convicted, they went outside and launched a protest. Now, I live in Washington, D.C., and there are a lot of protests at the Supreme Court constantly on many different issues, but in Sudan, this just doesn't happen. Because in Sudan, you'll get sent to prison immediately. But these people were so compelled to stand up for the freedom of others that they protested in front of the court saying, I am Miriam, everyone deserves religious freedom. And they risked their own lives to defend this woman, a Christian woman accused of apostasy. This had never happened before. They didn't just stop there, though. They organized press conferences. They organized briefings with Islamic leaders and opposition leaders, and they got everybody all throughout society to say that this woman deserved her freedom. And not only that, but one of them worked in one of the embassies in Khartoum, and he organized all of the embassies to come together and to stand in support of this woman. And they met with her lawyers, and every day my colleagues, my Sudanese lawyer colleagues, talked to her lawyers on the phone and gave them legal advice on how to defend this woman. And 6 weeks later, she was freed. But those 6 weeks in prison, this is what she went through. Week 1, the imams came to her to try to force her to recant her faith. Week 2, recant. Week 3, she delivers a baby girl, still shackled to the prison floor. Week 4, nothing. Week 5, still nothing. Week 6, nothing. But what would make Miriam still refuse to recant her faith? It's like one of the pastors there told me. The government's going to kill us if we stand for our freedom to worship, and they're going to kill us if we don't. So we choose to die standing. There are many, many Miriams in the world, as Mr. Patterson shared this morning, in Pakistan, in Iraq, in China, Nigeria. There are many of them. I've met them, I've seen their faces, and this story has given them a name. So now you can know them as well. You see, these people, they have courage that we can only imagine, that I could only imagine. One little boy that I met in Iraq last week when I was there visiting the refugees that had had to flee the Islamic State, I said to him, "Do you hate ISIS?" Because I thought, surely they hate ISIS as much as I do, and maybe as much as some of you do. And this little boy, 6 years old, said, "No, we don't hate them, we're praying for them." I thought, "Are you crazy? You're praying for them?" He said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, what if they made you forced to recant your belief?" And I learned that not one Christian in all of Iraq gave up their faith in the midst of ISIS. Not one. That's pretty amazing. Crucifixions, beheadings, so much, and yet not one. And this little boy, 6 years old, told me, they can't really force us to change our faith, to recant, because even inside we'll still be Christians, and they can't change that. You see, that's how we're hardwired. We're hardwired as spiritual human beings to worship God or to worship something else. But that's how he made us. And he made every human being that way. So those 5.3 billion people around the world that live under religious oppression, every single one of them deserves the freedom to choose. We hope they'll choose Christ, but the freedom to choose is a God-given right, because inside of us, we're hardwired to worship, to be free, to have our spirits seek him and know him. It reminds me now of the story of Esther. Many of you know the story. Esther lived at a time when the Jews were going to be exterminated from Babylon. Mordecai went to the queen, and he said to her, "Don't think that because you're in the king's house, you alone of all the people will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's family, they will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" I was in your position many years ago. I was a student at Vanguard from Orange County, California. We come from places of wealth and privilege and position and power. Even if you haven't walked through the halls of Congress like I have, you still have all of those resources. And these people that we're talking about tonight or today, they have the courage and we have the resources to give to them. So what can we do? How can we respond? Is it really possible to change their situation? Yeah, I believe Miriam's story tells us that it is. But it means that we have to be willing to be that Esther for them. And so that's what Hardwired does. We go around the world and we provide them the ability to stand on their own, to have the courage like these pastors asked me. Help us, stand with us. That's what they want. So what can you do? Well, when I was in college, I heard probably a similar message, and I heard about all of the persecution of Christians around the world, and I thought, I want to do something. And maybe today you want to do something too. But back when I was in college, there wasn't an outlet. There was no organization for me to go to. And so for 15 years, I worked hard. I was a teacher. I had to pay off my student loans, like many of you will have to do. You maybe won't go directly into a position like this. But I worked, and God opened my eyes to direct my steps into a place that I couldn't imagine. And he led me to England. He led me to Washington. And so for the last 10 years after teaching, I've been working in policy in Washington, directing congressional action on religious freedom and working for a law firm on religious freedom. And then I decided I wanted to start something for the people that were my age that didn't have a place to go. And so that's what Hardwired does. We provide an opportunity for you, wherever you're at, to know what's happening around the world, to be inspired by these stories of courage, and to respond. So how can you respond? How can you join Hardwired in being a part of this response to religious oppression around the world? Well, the first thing you can do is simply be aware of it. Many of you are involved in a lot of justice issues, as I mentioned earlier, and at the root of so much injustice in the world today is religious oppression. If you just take, for example, Iraq, when I was there, one of the top 5 reasons that people are able to qualify for refugee status is because of persecution based on religion. In Iraq, a majority of the people that are escaping and looking for refugee status are Christians fleeing because of persecution. Many of them are Yazidis as well. Trafficking. One woman that I met in Iraq had just had her 3-year-old daughter taken from her by an imam in a village, an ISIS imam, that wanted to take the child as a child bride. Another girl that I met, a Yazidi girl, maybe around in her 20s, I don't know, probably your age, shared the story of how she had been kidnapped, how she saw her family murdered before her eyes, and then she was used as a sex slave for weeks until she was finally able to escape. Trafficking, child marriage, refugees, and genocide. All of these exist in Iraq right now. But at the root is religious oppression. It's a group of people that say that their religious ideology needs to be imposed on everybody else. And whether those people are part of their own faith community or a different one, they have no choice but to convert or die. It was the same choice Miriam had. But we know that they can be changed. We know that there's hope because of what happened in Sudan. And if a place as dark as Sudan can change, then maybe a place like Iraq could too. So the first thing that you need to do whenever justice issues you're working in is just don't ignore religious oppression. For too long, it's been ignored. But in 2007, about 68% of the world lived under religious oppression, and today, it's 76%. So in the last 7 years, from the time you were in high school to college, it's grown that much. And imagine when you leave here, how much worse it will be if you don't do something. And religious oppression isn't just a little thing to be focused on. Really, it's at the heart of who we are as human beings that I mentioned at the beginning. And what we know as believers is that persecution and suffering will come to all of us. If Christ suffered, we will suffer. It's not just a justice issue to follow, it's a part of who we are as believers. When we're called to follow Christ, we're called to do what? To take up our cross and follow him. Yeah. That cross is not a comfort ride. It doesn't mean that we're going to have a safe journey. It means it's going to be hard. I know that a lot of people that I meet with, even that are persecuted and others, they want to escape that hard reality. They want the comfort. But that's not what God calls us to. But maybe you're not suffering right now, and so you're in a position like Esther where you can be that hope to others. So learn, know about the issues. The second thing that you can do is that you can teach others. This December, Hardwired will launch an educational program for schools across the United States and around the world. We'll take it to India, to Turkey, to Iraq, to many countries. And one of the things that we're going to do with this is provide it as a resource for schools all over the United States to simply learn what religious freedom is as a human right. You can go online, you can learn it yourselves, but then you can take it and teach it in a local school. Just share it, educate others. You can help us train. If you want to sponsor one of the people that we work with in Sudan, we've been supporting Miriam's lawyers, we've been supporting other trainees, we've been supporting a whole group of lawyers that are pushing back on this legal system because even though she was freed, her case still exists. The apostasy law is still there. There were 2 others that were convicted at the same time she was. One was forced to recant, and the other was sent to a mental institution. And if we don't want more Miriams to be put into prison, then we have to do what we can to provide them the legal support to keep pushing back when the time is ripe for change. So you can help us. When you go home today and you think about what I shared, I want you to remember the stories of hope in the end, the stories of courage. We don't often see many happily ever afters, many good endings in justice work. It's difficult, it's challenging, it's tough. But when you do see success, you realize, okay, there's hope, we can keep going. When you hear the little boy in Iraq story and what keeps inspiring him to keep going, it gives you courage. So just remember as you go home today, the calling that God put on you, not just to live here, but to be a part of the larger body of Christ, to stand with them, to advocate for them, and to be a part of that much bigger vision of what God has for his body. And know that you could actually be part of changing someone's life around the world in a small way or in a big way. And I don't know where God will take you when you graduate from here. I don't know the path that he has for you, and it may take you 15 years to figure it out. But when you do get there, I hope that you'll look back and you'll remember what God was speaking to you this morning, and that along the way you'll remember that you can only do it in his strength, because it's in his strength alone. And all of the glory, always, in everything that we do, should always go to him. Because when I was working on this issue in DC, if I had relied on my own strength, it would be discouraging many times. And you will get discouraged too. But just remember that Christ walked that road for you before you even got there. And that at the end, there's victory in sight. And so when we hear the stories of ISIS or of different things, know that he's called us to stand in the gap, and that in the end, he has been victorious. And you can be a part of that too, if you're hardwired for it, which I hope you are. Thank you.